on the strategies and challenges associated with aviation's net zero future, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Alan Boyle, an experienced journalist focused on space and science. Mr. Boyle is a contributing editor in GeekWire, founder of Cosmic Lock, and author of the book, The Case for Pluto, How a Little Planet Made a Big Difference.
Mr. Boyle has been awarded numerous prizes from the American Association for the Advancements of Science, the National Association for Scientific Writers, and many others. It is now my great pleasure to officially welcome our 5 panelists and pass on the floor to Mr. Boyle.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. This is really great. It's a pivotal time to focus on the future of sustainable aviation. In fact, the future is now. It's high time to bring sustainable aviation back from the future and put it into the present tense. In 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency said that commercial aircraft and large business jets account for 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation in the US, and for 3% of the nation's total greenhouse gas emissions. We'll have to find alternatives to fossil fuel air travel if we have any hope of meeting the climate challenge in the decades ahead. So today we've got a high-powered panel to talk about these challenges and about the strategies and technologies that can help the aviation industry meet its goal of zero-emission air travel by the year 2050. I'll introduce each panelist in turn and give them a minute or two to tell us where they're coming from on this issue. Alex Ivanenko is the co-founder and CEO of HyPoint, a Silicon Valley startup developing the next generation of zero carbon emission fuel cell systems for air transportation and urban air mobility. Alex, where are you coming from?
Hello, everyone. Alan, just a small correction, CEO and founder at HyPoint, because my company was acquired by ZeroAvia recently. So yeah, and so it's like a confirmation that we did actually great stuff, specifically for air transportation market, because our focus was on to develop a lightweight version of hydrogen fuel cells, specifically for air transportation needs. And we at the team understood earlier that without that, like a fuel cell and other solutions, it's almost impossible to do zero CO2 emission aviation. So we did a lot of efforts. We spent a lot of time on that product, and actually the product appeared in August 2022 when we tested it, and now we are working together with the ZeroAvia because they provided enough for us resources, expertise, and other stuff on different few projects in their pipeline. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Alex. Gregory Davis is the president and CEO of Aviation Aircraft, a company that's developing an all-electric commuter aircraft that integrates battery technology and electric propulsion. I attended the first flight of Aviation's Alice airplane last September in central Washington state, and so it's good to see you again, Gregory.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to see you, Alan, and thank you all for having me here. This is a great panel. So just to tell you a bit about Aviation, on September 27th of 2022, we flew the world's first all-electric commuter aircraft. And this picture that you see in the background behind me is actually taken from that flight. What was important about that is that we're in the business of bringing a fully electric commuter plane to the regional air mobility market. And with that first flight, we were able to demonstrate all of the core technology that you need in order to show that you can make a commercially viable electric commuter plane. It really opens up the doors to what we need to do as an industry in order to target the opportunity of completely eliminating emissions from the short range or regional air market.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Stephen Barrett is professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT and the director of the MIT Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment. The aim of Dr. Barrett's research is to help the aviation industry achieve zero environmental impacts. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan. It's great to be here at this conference again. I came last year, really fantastic conference, and thank you to the organizers. So where I'm coming from is that I view aviation as really central to a socially connected and economically connected and a culturally connected world. And I think the events that we can see going on in Europe today illustrate more than ever that we want more connection, not less today. So with that in mind, you know, I'm a committed environmentalist. I think aviation must get to zero environmental impact, but not by zero flights, instead by the technological and policy innovation that will be needed to get to zero. And I think for large commercial airliners, that is very distinct from the commuter aircraft that Gregory talked about. We don't see a future that is battery powered in the coming few decades, at least, maybe in the longer term. So that leaves sort of three big challenges: CO2, contrails, and NOx. And those are three big challenges that involve solutions around fuel, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel or hydrogen, operational measures like avoiding contrail formation, and new technologies that can be used to eliminate NOx. And so it's a tremendous challenge for a really tough industry to decarbonize, but it all physically is doable. And it will cost money. It won't be as expensive as some people think, but it won't be free. And that does mean that we do think policy support will be needed to make this happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Nick Molden is the founder and CEO of Emissions Analytics, as well as an honorary research fellow at Imperial College London. Nick specializes in advanced modeling techniques that can help businesses find ways to cut emissions while boosting the bottom line. Nick?
Thanks, Alan, and thank you very much for inviting me. So essentially, we don't invent anything, but what we do, we go and measure things. What gets us out of bed in the morning is working out what happens in terms of real world emissions. And this is particularly relevant in this area because of the difficulty of the challenge. But we cut our teeth, I cut my teeth on Dieselgate in passenger cars. And what that was about was great sounding official data, but terrible real world emissions. And because of the pressure to decarbonize in this area, there's always the potential for the same problem here. So what I'm keen on is knowing is that the CO2 reductions are real, the emissions reductions are real in practice. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. And allied to that, the other thing which is key for our way of thinking is it would be very easy to solve the CO2 problem by shutting down aviation. That's not what this is. This is about allowing aviation in a way that's compatible with the environment. This is not a covert, sneaky way of trying to ban aviation. By demonstrating real world decarbonization, it'll allow aviation to prosper long term.
Thank you, Nick. And the fifth speaker on our panel is Tom Light. He's the president and CEO of Aviation Climate Taskforce, a global coalition of leaders in the aviation sector who are seeking to accelerate technological breakthroughs that could make zero-emission air travel possible. Tom?
Thank you, Alan, and I'll echo Stephen's thank you to the organizers too. It takes a tremendous effort to pull these events off successfully. So thank you for the. And I think one of your questions was the approach. I think it's good to underline that the Aviation Climate Task Force is a charitable nonprofit organization. We were founded by 10 of the leading airlines, Southwest, Lufthansa, American, to name a few. And we're really utilizing their grant capital to address what we call the technological death valley. Many people call the technological death valley, which is to get a lot of those early stage technologies out of the laboratories to the point that they can tap into investment capital.
Great. Well, Tom, you started us off on that big picture, and I'm hoping you can help us set the stage for our discussion on sustainable aviation. What is at stake for the industry, for customers, and the traveling public? And dare I say it, what's at stake for the fate of the Earth? What's the most harmful impact of aviation on the environment, and where can sustainable aviation do the most good?
Well, you've assembled a very prestigious and eclectic panel, so I think this would be a good conversation. To frame it, you mentioned that I think in your statistics that aviation is a statistically significant proportion of our global GDP. And as Stephen mentioned, it's a really important part from a social perspective in terms of global cohesion, right? Right now, aviation is responsible for approximately 5% of global warming. But I think rather than that snapshot, we need to look at the trend, right? We're increasingly moving from, in the next few decades, we're going to move from the single digits to the double digits. And there's a likelihood that aviation could represent up to 15 to 20% of global CO2 emissions. And that's going to be driven by two factors. One is that the amount of fuel consumption by 2050 is going to double, right? It's going to be a lot more people traveling. And the second is that this is a hard to abate sector. And as other sectors get electrified and they decarbonize more rapidly, our share of those emissions are going to increase, right? And so I think the second part of your question was what's at stake, right? And I joined the climate action group because I think this is the fight of our times. Intergenerational struggle. I think of it kind of like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, in that there were people that were working in climate action before I joined, and the people in this room at Tufts University are going to be perhaps the climate tomorrow. I will be retired by the time 2050 comes around. And so that's one of the difficulties of climate action. But we're increasingly, I think we all read the news, we're increasingly rushing towards global tipping points. Just last week, I read that there's a scientific consensus that we might be facing the possibility of an ice-free Arctic summer somewhere between 2030 and 2040. And we all know what that will do to the Earth's planetary albedo. It's going to rush us towards maybe runaway climate change. And that's just one of many climate tipping points. And so we need to cut emissions as quickly as possible. Aviation is a hard to abate sector. And, the way I would, I'm sure that it would be, the way I would frame it is that, fossil fuels are kind of amazing in terms of their energy density, right? They're very difficult to replace. And so there's no silver bullet solution for the aviation sector. It's going to require a portfolio of solutions. The holy grail may be in the long term that we're going to need power to liquid or e-fuels or radical redesign of the airplane. But in the short term, we need to use every tool that's available to us, including bio-based sustainable aviation fuels, including electric airplanes, including a portfolio of different solutions, all of which we're looking at. And when I look at the aviation climate action agenda, what concerned me most working in the sector, from my perspective, was that we're not yet lining up the blocks of effort that are required to fund scientific research, right? I think the private sector is trying to coalesce around solutions as quickly as possible, but public policy is going to precede a lot of the market development. And that was kind of the genesis behind the creation of the Aviation Climate Taskforce, along with the other airlines, is we're trying to pool proprietary capital to fund scientific research so that those early stage developments are available in 5 years for investment. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. I think I might have spoken a little bit.
Yeah, I thought I would open it up to the other panelists a little bit on this issue of why it's so difficult to address this challenge. I know that some of you have talked about, we're going to have this airplane ready by X date, and then it turns out, well, that might not work. It's more complicated than that. Is it because of the technical factors? You mentioned energy density and how good fossil fuel is when it comes to energy density. You also mentioned policy challenges. And I suppose there's also the issue of inertia among the public. I think, for example, with the automobile industry, people are just used to the kinds of cars that they have and the fuel infrastructure that they have, and it's hard to break those habits. So I think that some of the people on this panel have faced this issue firsthand, is why it's not as easy as you may have thought it was when you started all this.
So I can jump in there. I think, Alan, if that suits everyone. So Tom, you've hit some of the key talking points that same way I would have said them about explaining the industry, and certainly we agree that it's going to require all of the technology to bridge the gap between where we are today with aviation and air travel and where we need to go into the future. And we talk about the 3 C's, about carbon, cost, and convenience. And to your point, we're a commercial entity, so we're a business. We're looking at how we can service a market demand, and that's our focus. But at the same time, we feel that the future of the aerospace industry needs to be focused around sustainability. And I think looking broadly at some of the aircraft concepts that are out there, and market positions that are being taken up by major players in the industry. When you look at where the most activity is right now, certainly from my perspective, the most exciting activity focuses around sustainability. We're at Aviation focusing on the regional air mobility sector. So it's about those short range flights that, this is not commonly known, but more than half of all the world's air travel is actually 500 nautical mile flights or less, and a full 20 to 30% of all flights are actually 250 nautical miles or less. So when you get out and you go and you fly, if you think about it, a lot of the flights you do are going to be about an hour long. And when you look at the current demand for aircraft in that sector, there's about 4,000 planes that we could go in and replace today with the routes that they operate today, if we had the aircraft, an electric or sustainable tech aircraft ready to do that. In terms of the challenge of bridging today to when we can get an aircraft enter into service, what we're looking at here is we're building an airplane, right? So to optimize, again, the usable energy on an aircraft or an airplane, like what we've done with Alice, which is what we call an electric conventional takeoff and landing aircraft, we've really focused on optimizing the design around the batteries and the electric propulsion unit. And each sector of the industry is going to have to face that challenge where you either need to adapt the technology to existing to existing platform, and focus on doing that, or you need to optimize. Because the energy density in batteries is so much lower than other forms of fuel, whether it's the jet fuel or hydrogen, certainly the potential for these fuels. For us, the challenge is really focused around designing a whole new aircraft to optimize the utility. And that's what we need to do, is we need to actually line up the development cycle of an aircraft with the technology advancement of the batteries that we're going to put in it. So that's our perspective.
While we've got you, Greg, I wonder if you could just back up a little bit and tell us a little bit about your all-electric solution. We have people representing various perspectives on which solution makes the most sense from where you're standing. And I thought, let's start with all electric, because that seems like it would be the simplest way to do it.
So yeah, thanks, Alan. So what we're doing at Aviation is exactly that. It's a fully electric airplane. So it means that we have batteries that the aircraft is designed around, and those power the aircraft's electric propulsion units or electric engines. And that's our approach here. And in order to make this work, you have to design the product around the technology. The electric engine is the first advancement in aircraft propulsion that we've had since we went from the Super Constellation to the 707, right? So from the piston aircraft to the jet aircraft 70 years ago. And what you saw in the late 1950s was a radical change in the design of aircraft. And some of that's been hit on here. And certainly some of the broader concepts of other technology development are also looking at new radical designs for aircraft. In our case, it's about taking the existing concept of a commuter category airplane and then making it electric. And that's what we focused on.
You mentioned that the first flight took place in September, and I've always been curious what's been happening since that first flight. I suppose it takes a while to review the data and know whether it's really been successful, but maybe in 25 words or less, you can let us know where you're standing with Alice right now.
We generated terabytes of data that we've reviewed, and we are happy with what we did. And we are now focused on building our aircraft company and bringing the aircraft through the certification program.
And what's the time frame? I think you've talked about time frames before, but when do you expect to go into service?
Our target entry into service is late 2027, and so that will have us certifying the aircraft, in the next just under 5 years, which is actually pretty typical for an aircraft development program. And if I may steal 30 more seconds here, just in terms of what we're doing with bringing our product to market, we feel that we've found the sweet spot for an electric plane, which is we found the weight of an aircraft that you can certify in a commuter category. We can fly from existing airports using existing airspace with pilots that have existing pilots licenses and certify it using the existing system. And that's why we think this is a really the right approach for getting a first product to market that can actually start working without producing any emissions. I mean, the aircraft has no tailpipe. It literally produces no emissions while it's flying.
Okay, I think this is a good segue to Alex, because your company is working on a different approach with hydrogen fuel cells, and as you
Correct.
mentioned, you're working with Zero Avia on a hybrid hydrogen battery plane, which is very much in the development phase. And so maybe you could tell us about that project and your perspective on where fuel cells enter the picture.
Yeah, so you should understand that there are two types of fuel cells available on the market, right? So specifically for air transportation needs, low temp and high temp. And you're absolutely right. So you must add additional battery if you're going to use low temperature fuel cell, especially in takeoff regime of operation of the aircraft. So at HyPoint, we developed high temperature fuel cell system, which actually allowed us to exclude buffer battery from the system design at all. So, and in our case, we are usually bring the idea that we are like a fully electric aircraft too, can supply fuel cell without batteries. And of course, so we use some small battery, but the role of this battery is not buffering. It's for transient modes when you are, how to say, go from 0 to maximum power and from maximum power to like 0 and etc. It's generate a lot of energy power, and they have to have some special device, lithium capacitor, I would say, which can consume that energy from the fuel cell. But once again, this is a completely different role of batteries rather than in comparison with low temperature fuel cell system.
Do you feel as if hydrogen is going to be a long-term solution for fueling aviation? Because some people might say, well, you know, battery technology is eventually going to get so good that we won't need to have hydrogen as an energy carrier. We can just go directly to electricity.
Absolutely. So actually, I also, before when I was at HyPoint a couple of years ago, I promoted the idea, hey guys, so lithium batteries do not work at all. But I changed my mind. The idea right now is aviation is a huge market, right? It's not only one aircraft, right? So we are going to electrify. So it depends on the mission, depends on the customer profile, I would say. The different types of power sources available for that application. I don't want to say that high temp will win everywhere. Of course not. I don't want to say that LTPM is a bad technology which you cannot integrate it. Yes, of course, it can be integrated. And actually, just a few weeks ago, we executed first fly 90-seater aircraft with low temperature fuel cell, and it works. And Gregory, what he's doing is the battery. So depends on the mission, depends on the market segment, different types of power sources available. And HyPoint and Zero Avia, specifically with our technology, we found a certain niche, right? So it's a megawatt power class fuel cells, specifically for bigger aircrafts, 90 plus passengers. Plus, I'm right now leading at Zero Avia rotorcraft division. So it's also very, what can I say? It also works well with helicopters, right? So if you develop fuel cell and power plants specifically for helicopters market segment, again, it works well. But at the same time, I see a lot of projects where eVTOLs and small helicopters integrated lithium batteries. It means that we're just targeting to different missions, right? We're targeting to emergency, medical emergency services where you have to fly 3-4 hours, right? And unfortunately, lithium batteries at this stage, right? cannot deliver such enough energy density. But for short flights, like a 10 minutes flight, air taxi concept, lithium batteries works well. That is why I say, okay, no problem. It's a customer choice, it's a market choice, and etc. Hope I was clear on what on my messages.
Mm-hmm. And whenever you talk about hydrogen, I think the Hindenburg question always comes up about the safety of hydrogen fuel. What do you tell people about that? I'm sorry, but somebody's got to bring it up.
So I don't know. So I actually exhausted to answer on this question for 3 years, right? So when I built my company, every time I hear that question, of course not. So hydrogen is the safest gas, and actually a lot of examples on the market when the different types of accidents happened with hydrogen. And Hindenburg, if you remember that story, it was more than 70 years, 80 years ago, right? So, and the reason why it happened, it was completely not, how to say, caused by hydrogen itself. So of course it's hydrogen itself, but it was damaged balloon, right? So it was terrible weather condition and etc. etc. In once again, I actually a couple years ago checked how many accidents with hydrogen happened in Europe, and I just found for the last 25 years it was about I don't remember specific figure, but it was about 30 accidents, and all of that happens during the manufacturing of hydrogen, not exploit of hydrogen. Do you feel differences? So in the manufacturer side, it usually happens, not when you are use hydrogen already in tanks. By the way, Toyota Mirai, right? So it's a great example from Toyota. So my Toyota Mirai 1 and 2nd generation, available on the market. So it's absolutely approved. I'm living in California right now, and I'm using Toyota Mirai every day. I'm still survive and live, and something happens. So everything is good for me, right? So that is why I think this is like people try to make some elephant from to small mosquitoes, I would say. So if you understand what I mean. So once again, hydrogen is a very safety technology. And once again, for aviation specifically, this technology in hydrogen specifically will not used by private person, right? So it will be specialists and experts in that field who will refuel aircraft, support and maintain the aircraft. So I don't think it should be a big issue at all.
Well, I'm glad we took care of the mosquito in the room. So, Stephen, you've been involved in some pretty exotic aviation technologies. For example, something called ionic wind or electroaerodynamic propulsion. Could you give us an overview on the technological tricks that could get us to the future age of sustainable aviation, including maybe some tricks we haven't really heard of?
Sure. I mean that's obviously talking much further out, and I guess maybe later we can pivot back to sort of the nearer term. But
yeah,
you know, if you think about a bit like what Gregory said, you know, for since the dawn of flight, we've used propellers and turbines to move air for propulsion, and even with electric flight, we still use propellers and turbines. So it is a big step forward in terms of the powertrain being used. But I mean, when I was growing up, I watched Back to the Future, and I thought we'd have hoverboards and flying cars and stuff like that by now. And where are they? Right? It's just like, what happened? So anyway, I thought, well, at least some element. One of the benefits of being an academic, and like many people at Tufts, is you can do what you want. And obviously, I spend most of my time focused on trying to make the large commercial aircraft more sustainable. But some of the time is on thinking, 50 years plus ahead. And one of that is saying, well, what could you use other than propellers and turbines to propel aircraft, a bit like the shuttlecraft in Star Trek? And it turns out there is a physical phenomena that could do that. It's called electroaerodynamics, or more colloquially, ionic wind. And that's essentially where you ionize air and use electrostatic fields to accelerate the ionized air. And we've flown in the past a small prototype out indoors, and hopefully later this year we plan to do our second major flight campaign with an outdoor flying prototype, still only carrying a small payload weighing several kilograms. But maybe over time that could be something that could do things like urban package delivery with silent drones that could deliver things with no propellers, no annoying noise, and who knows what beyond that. But I mean, we're talking quite far out. But I think The thing that's really pressing for the world right now is thinking about solutions on a 2050 timescale for the large commercial aircraft that dominate the fuel burn, and those are the things that keep me awake at night in terms of worrying about the future of the planet.
There's a scene in a classic movie, The Graduate, where the main character gets one word of advice from a friend of his parents: plastics. Is there one word that has a great future in aviation technology? I thought I'd start out with you, Stephen, but if anybody else has a one word thing to watch, I'd love to hear it.
Contrails would be my word. So contrails cause as much warming as all of CO2 from aviation. And then the kicker is that the CO2 from aviation, once you emit it, essentially stays in the atmosphere or very slowly is removed. So in other words, the warming from aviation CO2 today is the accumulation of all CO2 from aviation since the dawn of the jet age. So 60 plus years. But contrails are like artificial clouds that trap heat, and they only last up to maybe 6 hours. So those 6 hours of contrails cause as much warming as the whole history of aviation CO2. Now, the upside is that if we figure out a way to delete those contrails, we can not only reduce aviation warming, but roll it back to how it would have been decades ago. And so it's a huge opportunity for the industry to make rapid and cheap progress.
Anybody else have any words of wisdom? One word of wisdom?
I think people, as a word of wisdom, right? We're doing this for the ability to connect and what aviation brings to our communities. I mean, it's like Tom said it perfectly. I had the same conversation the other day. Aviation is really the holy grail of sustainability. If you can make this sustainable, then you can make anything sustainable, which is part of why it's so important that we continue to focus on this. But whether it's us receiving our packages overnight the way that we've become accustomed to, or being able to go and see our families. I mean, over the past 3 years, people have moved to smaller communities, but now we're of course getting pulled back to the larger cities for work and for other events. And we want to make this convenient for people to continue to enjoy the benefits of flying and frankly, even expand what we can do with aviation and aircraft, but we need to do it without harming the environment.
Great. Well, Nick, you're the perfect person to help us dive into the data and size up the different technologies for reducing aviation-related emissions. And we've talked about electric and hydrogen-powered propulsion, but there are other technologies out there. Sustainable aviation fuel is a big one. Can you tell us about those technologies and anything that we haven't touched upon so far that can really come to the fore as we think about the future of sustainable aviation?
Sure. Sustainable itself is a slippery word, and I always like to try and grip these words and understand what we're really saying. And my observation is that sustainable currently is used to denote everything from somewhat reduced CO2 to completely eliminated CO2. And those are obviously quite different degrees of improvement. And then overlaid on that is you've got, I guess, the concept of what in automotive we would call zero tailpipe emissions, which is actually different from completely zero emissions, and indeed different from net zero emissions as well. So I think my first sort of plea is for us to start being more rigorous about the terminology we use. And on the automotive side, I have a particular beef with battery electric vehicles because, and particularly in Europe, they're given this wonderful legal stamp of approval of being zero emission, when they're largely not. Even if you fuel them with purely wind or nuclear power, no battery electric vehicle is made with no CO2 in its construction. So that label of zero emission is really misleading. So I think transport that over to the aviation side. Just because you have something that doesn't put CO2 out as it's flying doesn't mean it is, quote, sustainable. And then you have synthetic fuels, on the other hand, which actually would put out a lot of tailpipe CO2, apologize for using tailpipe, but you know what I mean. Tailpipe CO2, but it can be absorbing an equal and opposite amount of CO2 in its production. So in that case, actually something which is officially high tailpipe may actually be really lower net CO2 than something that claims to be zero emission. So terminology is really important in this. In terms of the technologies themselves, well, obviously we're discussing a lot, hydrogen fuel cells, hydrogen combustion, or batteries. In both those cases, creating that energy from green sources, from low CO2 sources is vital and fairly obvious. And then you've got renewable fuels from waste products from crops, which are then processed into liquid replacement aviation fuel. And then you've got the pure synthetic fuel, so created from sequestering CO2 from the air and creating a synthetic hydrocarbon, which that in a sense possibly is the holy grail because it can be used as a drop-in. Its problem is it's very energy intensive to produce, and until we get to a world where our whole energy backbone is decarbonized, maybe by significantly expanding nuclear, for example. If we got to that world, then those pure synthetic fuels become possible. And they have spin-off benefits as well about reduced pollutant emissions like NOx and particles, particularly around airports on takeoff. So, and we could see how these things could line up in a sense in a series. As the technology scales and becomes available, we can deploy those technologies in different combinations over time.
United Airlines recently announced a $100 million initiative to promote sustainable aviation fuel. Is that the sort of initiative that will move the needle, or will it take something different, some totally different approach or a combination of approaches? I suppose that's the answer. Yeah,
again, it sounds lovely. What's not to like? But we need to, dig below those lovely words. And I don't mean to impugn anyone's reputation in that, but I guess the three factors that we always need to look at is scale. Things may be a great idea, but unless you can industrially scale them to some useful degree, it's not going to move any dial at all. Linked to that is the question of provenance. And what we found in Europe with HVO, which is a replacement diesel in road vehicles, is that there's such a pressure on demand that the price is bid up in the market, and the unscrupulous players then essentially relabel some fossil diesel as HVO, and because there is little surveillance of the quality of the fuel in the market and anti-fraud prevention, you think you're buying HVO and fueling your truck with it, someone's ripped you off. And so making sure, provenance, by provenance I mean making sure what you think you're burning is what actually you are burning. And the last bit is quality as well, which is again a linked factor. There's an opportunity with these products to have fewer aromatic compounds in them and leading to fewer noxious air pollutants as you burn them. But again, that needs to be made sure that that is really true about those fuels, not some warm words. So I really do welcome this initiative, but the execution of it needs to be really good and really diligent.
I've got a quick question before we kind of go into the wider discussion round, which our time is already getting shorter than I anticipated it would, but I can't resist asking about airships, because there are a number of climate fiction novels, cli-fi novels I've read that refer to airships, how they're the big thing in a post-climate era. Is there any viability to that, Nick, or is that just a science fiction dream?
Well, the Chinese probably will use them for surveillance over the United States. That aside, I suspect not, for speed and controllability issues, if nothing else. I have to confess it's not my specialist area, but Well, but what it does actually illustrate an interesting question as to what degree we're willing to accept utility compromise as the price of decarbonisation. And that's what BEVs are. They are requiring some utility compromise. And what's particularly challenging about aviation is, with aviation, you don't really want utility compromise. You don't want range anxiety in an aeroplane. You know, so I think we have to, we're more constrained in aviation because not willing to give up the utility. And I think airships, in terms of speed, controllability, whatever, many dimensions, it probably doesn't tick enough boxes.
And just imagine JFK or Heathrow Airport with, an airship a minute bumbling its way in and trying to kind of dock and land and things like that. It's going to be pretty challenging, really.
Well, they did it on Top Gear. They did it on Top Gear in the UK, and the thing drifted into the flight path of an airport and caused general chaos. So maybe the Top Gear guys weren't as diligent as others would be. Well, that's probably very true. I'm not sure that's where I'd invest my money.
I had a couple of toss-up questions before we get into audience questions, and one is talking. The subject has already been introduced. Is aviation in this future sustainable age going to look radically different from how it looks today, or is that the point, that it can't look different? Does it have to be the way that we're doing things today?
I think it's a mix, Alan. It's a great question, by the way. You look at the evolution of the technology, and aviation's had its beginnings with pop-up people building their own aircraft but they also had to build an airport. That was the beginning of aviation. Sorry. What we saw in terms of going back to our roots on the regional air mobility side is that there used to be all kinds of airlines that operated around the United States, and it's the same story around the world. But up until the late 1970s, there's 5,000 airports in the US. I think 3,500 of them have paved strips and certificates that you could use to operate an airline from, and we use about 100 of them for regular commercial service, 500 for commercial service in some form. And then there's 2,000 airports that the FAA has said could be used that just aren't being used. And so you can build something that looks very much the same as what we, maybe our parents saw, and what we maybe as kids we used to be able to take advantage of. And we can build that out again for our kids, my kids, or perhaps grandchildren as we build this thing out. So there's going to be some of that. And then there's also all kinds of other changes that are happening, not just to the type of product, the aircraft and its operation, but airspace technologies. And these have been evolving. It's a regulated industry, so they don't evolve at the fastest pace, but they have been evolving to allow for things like point-to-point travel, and there is autonomous capabilities that have evolved, and then other forms of flight. So I think you're going to see a mix, but I don't think you're going to see the traditional form of air travel go away. What you're going to see instead is an increase in other forms of air travel.
Great. Does anybody else have anything you want to weigh in on what the future of air travel is going to look like? Is it going to look like the present of air travel?
I think when it comes to taking long-haul, large commercial flights, it will look, in some sense, depressingly similar from the customer experience perspective, because just think about the longevity of the assets, right? There's something like $1 trillion of assets airborne right now. Those assets have a life 30 years. And the main airframers, the main manufacturers of aircraft can't produce them fast enough. There's multi-year lines to buy, A320 or 737 size aircraft. So we're not going to throw away these aircraft. So that tells you that the things that are flying today will be flying in 2050. Many of them, either the exact same aircraft that's in the air today or one that's a very slight derivative of it. And that's sort of something we have to live with as part of the portfolio of solutions that we come up with is sustainable fuels, to use that word that Nick isn't satisfied with, but that's, I guess, what people seem to use to deal with those. But then I do think that we will see new product lines, new capabilities coming online with technologies a bit like what you're hearing today and on the more regional scale.
If I may chip in,
Yes.
I think a lot of the thing which will determine the shape of the aviation is the relative cost of it in terms of the degree to which people will be able to afford to travel. But I mean, it is easy, I guess, to make the assumption that air travel is going to become more expensive. That's probably the case, and decarbonization comes generally with a price, and that will undoubtedly reshape the industry. But the other aspect, I think, which will determine the shape is the degree to which we decarbonize our grids. You know, if we don't decarbonize them very well, we will have to rely upon highly efficient, or the most efficient modes of air travel, more tending towards the battery electric side. If we decarbonize the grid effectively, then things like synthetic fuels will become possible, and we can effectively afford to carry relatively poor efficiencies. So those government decisions about the energy backbone of the economy will be really key.
I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to enter questions into the Q&A box on the Zoom window, and we'll try to take those. We're already we have one question so far, and I'm sure we'll get some more. My last question kind of circles back to the big issue: is getting to net zero by 2050 an achievable goal? Do you think that this is actually going to become a reality, or will we kind of stumble along into some, indeterminate age where people just don't know what's going to happen with the climate challenge? Maybe Tom, you can start us off on that.
Oh, that's a tough one. Listen, I think, one of my Abraham Lincoln quotes is that when you have the will of the people, anything is possible. Without the will of the people, nothing is possible, right? And so Nick made a comment about United Airlines $100 million investment fund, right? It's a great step in the right direction. But I am concerned about this dangerous philosophy that capital markets can do it all. Right? There's no pathway to success where the government doesn't play a very important role in funding projects, or at least setting the rules for how the market competes. So we're not there yet. I think that when you look at, I think that the private sector is doing a phenomenal job. United Airlines effort, they're one of the most, if not the most aggressive airline in terms of tackling climate change and trying to stop it in its tracks. But they are looking for risk-adjusted market rates of returns on those investments, right? And what I am concerned about is that public policy needs to start lining up the blocks of effort that we need to, develop these markets further. And it's really hard. That's almost a political question. So I don't take 2050 personally I'm not in the business of making projections, but I don't take it as necessarily guaranteed. I'd be very interested to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Happy to, just briefly, my perspective. I mean, firstly, I would always question whether net zero is actually the desirable goal. I mean, it obviously is achieved totemic status, but why not net minus 90%? There has to be, ultimately, we're trading off something against something else. So, but let's say net zero is what we want. I think there is a narrow path. There is a narrow path, but without a major component of nuclear fission in that, it's unachievable. We'll make good progress, but net zero, not unless we build a load of nuclear fission plants. I think it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, first and foremost, we have to do something. We have to do it now, right? So I think those points are very well made. But let's start with what we can achieve now. I think that pressing forward to a dramatic reduction in emissions and pollution has been also hit upon, is what we absolutely need to focus on, and that certainly, we see a commercial path to making that happen in a way that's going to, work for our customers, work for our passengers and operators. So I think that's what we can bring here from a corporate, commercial perspective, while looking at what we can do responsibly. But I also agree with Tom and Nick, and I think with everybody, we need to press on the regulators and other organizations that have say in what we do in order to make sure that we're successful. In the United States, late last year, it was, I think that Senate Bill S516 was passed to actually promote intra-agency cooperation between the FAA and the Department of Energy and other parts of the DOT to look and see where we can apply learnings from national energy research laboratories and other activities on battery research, on electrification and emissions control, and even something unheard of, perhaps share funding across organizations to get the work done. Just on a personal note from Aviation, we were given a tremendous opportunity on the 28th of September, the day after our first flight, to actually testify before the Senate subcommittee on the reauthorization of the FAA. And one of our points that we wanted to make was to find a way to make sure that the technologies that we were developing can be accepted globally, right? So whether it's the FAA or EASA leading a technology development, we don't want to have to go and design a battery or other propulsion system or other system with one set of regulatory standards for North America and a different standard for Europe and Australia. It's a global industry. We want cooperation across the regulators to make sure that we can get our products out to market and start making things better as soon as possible.
Great. Well, I'll turn it over to our moderators, or I should say our organizers, to pose some questions for the panel.
So does anybody in the room have any questions? Yes, in the blue pants.
I'm Sam. Can they hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So we've talked about a lot of different fuel types, a lot on electric and hydrogen. I guess I'm a little surprised that like biofuels weren't mentioned. Maybe it's because the carbon emissions are equal to a lot of times. There's a lot that says that their emissions are pretty equal to fossil fuels, but it seems like the Department of Energy, if we're talking about bringing government finance and bringing that to market, I mean, I was also looking into how the Department of Energy seems to be supporting that fuel type. So my question is, which fuel type would you say is farthest along? And what are the traditional manufacturers? Like what are the Boeings or maybe GE Aviation? Like what are they doing in this space? Because I don't see anyone in the panel kind of representing.
Well, I guess I can take a stab. I mean, I think getting back to Nick's point about terminology, so the biofuels, or I guess I'd call it biomass derived sort of drop-in fuel, something like that. Sometimes it's called sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, and that's really the phrase the industry uses most often now. So the sustainable fuels really is the biofuels to first order, at least today. That's the fuel that is most developed and closest to large scale use. It's still not really used at large scale, but there are companies that produce it at small scale. Unlike, for example, power to liquid fuels, which is at an earlier stage. I think it's the area that really does make sense to invest in the near term, because we can produce biomass derived fuels at a cost that's not massively greater than conventional fuels, but it's still going to be greater. I think that gets back to a point Tom made that this is not going to happen for free. So no matter how many $100 million investments are made, the free market as it's currently constructed will never get us to net zero by any date, let alone 2050. So we really do have to have a change in the market structure, whether it's mandate or a carbon price or some other mechanism. There needs to be political level agreements and action that will sustain a functioning market within which airlines and fuel producers can make rational decisions for their businesses that get us to net zero. And that's what we really lack now.
One thing that I would add to that, and agree with everything Stephen just said, is we're working closely with the Department of Transportation and USDA. They're all those agencies states and biofuels, right? And today's conversation, maybe it was more futuristic, and so we're talking about power to liquid fuels or e-fuels, which aren't available on the market, as Stephen said, and as Nick said, even if they were, they depend upon renewable energy and getting the electrical grid to renewable energy to scale. But I do find it interesting that the United States, it seems from my perspective, has taken a more approach to biofuels compared to the Europeans that are focused on power to liquid fuels. And I've noticed that in my conversations, recently with different individuals.
Is there another question in the queue?
So we'll now read one question from Zoom and then go back to the room. So we have a question from Mr. Ness asking Mr. Gregory Davis, I'm very interested in Alice, the plane that Eviation is developing. I was wondering why your website specifies 250 nautical miles VFR day range. Does this mean that the plane is not yet certified to fly IFR or at night?
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for your interest in Alice. So we chose 250 nautical miles day VFR as our range for our website because it's actually the most generally explainable range for the aircraft. There's VFR means visual flight rules, so it's your ability to fly the plane from one airport to another directly without using some of the other infrastructure in the air traffic control system. And it's got a pretty standard rule all around the world, which is the distance of the flight plus a 30-minute reserve. And that's day VFR. There's different reserves at night, and a reserve means the ability to fly longer. And so when you get into things like night flying or instrument flight rules, there's other factors that come into play. So regionality, but also with instrument flight rules, which is when you use more of the infrastructure, like whether it's navigational aids or otherwise. You have to have alternative airports specified. So the range for an instrument flight rule operation will depend on what the operation itself is. That's why we chose day VFR. Now, I'll just say the aircraft is going through the certification process. Now, we've flown the technology demonstrator, we've learned a lot, and now we're productionizing the aircraft. Yes, it will have the ability to fly IFR and nighttime, and it'll have an anti-icing system or de-icing system and so on. So it's going to be broadly usable the way that you want to use the aircraft.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answer. And as it is now 5:30, we unfortunately have to end the panel. We just wanted to thank our moderator and all of our panelists and everybody who came virtually and who joined us in person at TELS. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.